Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a fascinating journey through two incredible timelines, the biological history of life on Earth and the evolution of scientific thought itself. We're going to accurately describe and explain the core foundations of evolutionary biology, drawing directly from the incredible history of scientific discovery. Let's get started. Here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the two major schools of thought, move on to the pioneers of evolutionary theory, dive into how early life actually began, look at the massive leap to eukaryotes, and wrap up with the classic showdown, Lamarck versus natural selection. All right, let's jump right into part one, two schools of thought. Back in the 19th century, there was this massive divide in how we understood biology. You essentially had two completely different ideas about how life came to be. On one hand, you had the theory of special creation. Think of Carl Linnaeus, the guy who literally invented the system we use for naming organisms. He and others argued that a divine force created life as a static, unchanging entity, basically exactly as we see it today. But on the flip side, you had the theory of evolution. This wasn't just a Darwin thing, it was a line of thought stretching way back to Aristotle, suggesting that the insane diversity of life we see dynamically transformed and evolved from totally different, much earlier forms. Which brings us to section 2, the pioneers of evolutionary theory. To accurately describe how this monumental shift in thinking happened, we have to look at a few brilliant minds who laid the absolute groundwork for modern biology. Take Thomas Malthus. He figured out that populations multiply exponentially, but resources only grow arithmetically, which means scarcity and competition are basically inevitable. Then, over in paleontology, you had Georges Cuvier proposing catastrophism, the idea that sudden, massive, violent events shaped the Earth. Compare that directly to geologist James Hutton, who argued for uniformitarianism. He thought, no, it's actually slow, continuous, super gradual processes shaping our planet. And we definitely can't forget Ernst Haeckel and his biogenetic law. He famously stated that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In plain English, he believed that as an embryo develops, it essentially fast-forwards through the entire evolutionary history of its ancestral species. It's just wild to think about how all these different fields collided to build a single theory. So all of this builds up to one absolutely crucial year, 1859. That is the year Charles Darwin dropped his world-changing book on natural selection. But here's a detail that often gets overlooked. Darwin was actually heavily motivated to finally publish because of Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace had figured out the exact same mechanism totally independently. He literally sent Darwin papers with these strikingly similar ideas, and they even co-published some work together in 1858. But it was Darwin's massive, comprehensive 1859 release of On the Origin of Species that really cemented natural selection in the scientific record. All right, let's pivot from the history of thought to the actual biological history. Part 3, How Early Life Began. Because let's be real, life didn't just start in some gentle sunlit puddle. It kicked off in incredibly brutal conditions, specifically around deep-sea hydrothermal vents. These extreme hot springs were basically the only things capable of supplying the massive energy required to survive early Earth's toxic environment. And those very first organisms, they were heterotrophic. That means they couldn't make their own food. They survived by literally scavenging and consuming existing organic molecules. And it gets crazier. When autotrophic life finally did evolve, organisms that could actually synthesize their own energy, they didn't even use water to do it. They used hydrogen sulfide. When you track this incredible journey on a timeline, the scale is just mind-blowing. It took a staggering 2 billion years just to make the leap from those simple, single-celled archaeobacteria 3.5 billion years ago up to complex eukaryotic cells. And a hugely critical shift happens right around 420 million years ago. That's when ancient cyanobacteria finally pumped out enough oxygen to form the ozone layer. By blocking out that deadly UV radiation from space, the Earth transitioned from a harsh, reducing environment into a safe, oxidizing one. That was the exact moment life could truly explode and flourish on the surface. Let's zero in on that critical 1.5 billion year mark. Section 4, the leap to eukaryotes. To really explain this monumental upgrade in biological history, we rely on Lynn Margulis's endosymbiotic hypothesis. It's essentially a 3-step process where a simple cell basically swallowed another one, but instead of digesting it for lunch, it kept it as a permanent roommate. So, step 1, a larger cell ingests a smaller bacterium. Step 2, against all odds, the smaller one is not digested. And step 3, they actually form a mutually beneficial relationship. That ingested bacterium completely stabilizes and becomes a functioning internal organelle. Now, you might be wondering, how do we actually know this happened? Well, the evidence is a total genetic smoking gun. Mitochondria and chloroplasts, the powerhouses of complex cells, have their own distinct DNA and their own ribosomes for building proteins. And get this, they possess 70 S ribosomes. That is the exact size and type found in ancient, free-floating bacteria, completely different from the 80 S ribosomes making up the rest of the host cell. We know for a fact that mitochondria evolved from ingested aerobic bacteria, and plant chloroplasts came from ancient cyanobacteria. I mean, they even have double membranes, they operate semi-autonomously, and they replicate all on their own. It is absolutely fascinating. But what about the rest of the cell? For other crucial structures, scientists point to the membrane invagination hypothesis. Imagine the cell's outer wall literally folding inward, creating these deep, intricate channels that eventually pinched off inside. These newly internalized membranes independently formed the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi bodies. This was a complete game changer because it created a safe, secure vault to house the cell's replicating DNA deep inside. Which brings us to our final chapter, Section 5, Lamarck versus Natural Selection. We're going to use a classic case study here. How did the giraffe really get its extremely long neck? It sounds like a child's question, right? But this simple puzzle actually sparked a massive scientific debate. Did the giraffe physically stretch its neck over time, or was there something much more complex at play? So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck pitched this idea called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He figured that as giraffes continuously stretched to reach higher leaves, their necks physically got longer during their actual lifetime, and they just passed that newly acquired long neck straight to their babies. Makes intuitive sense, right? But natural selection tells a completely different story: differential survival. In reality, there were always short and long-necked giraffes. When the lower food sources dried up, the short-necked ones tragically starved. The long-necked ones survived, reproduced, and passed down the winning genetic code. The guy who definitively myth-busted Lamarckism was August Weismann. He rigorously tested Lamarck's theory by cutting off the tails of mice for 20 continuous generations. His logic was, if Lamarck was right, eventually these mice should be born without tails because they had acquired a tailless trait. But probably to the frustration of the researchers, and definitely the mice, the tails grew back every single time. This experiment accurately described a foundational rule of modern biology. Somatic, or physical body changes like building huge muscles or losing a tail, are not inherited. Only the genetic traits actually encoded in your DNA make it to the next generation. And understanding this exact mechanism leaves us with a pretty provocative thought about us, humans. If only genetic traits are passed on, as our own environment rapidly changes today, which of our genetic traits will natural selection favor tomorrow? We are all walking around carrying unseen, hidden genetic mutations. As the world shifts, some of those random codes might just be the very key to our future differential survival. Well, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope this deep dive has helped you see the incredible, totally wild complexity of life with a bit more clarity. Catch you next time.